Want to open your Bibles to the 18th chapter of the book of Acts. Acts chapter 18. It'll be a little while before we get there, but that'll be the first passage that we actually turn and read tonight. I don't know about you, but I'm struggling this evening. I feel that hour of sleep that I lost. I told Glenn just a moment ago I need a nap, but we're going to finish this sermon before I get one. But anyway, I'm going to stay down here so I'll stay awake. At least if I fall, it won't be as far to fall. So I'll stay down here with you all tonight. Speaking of being tired, get your thinking caps on. I want to test your knowledge a little bit tonight. Some of you want to answer, that's fine. If you don't, that's fine too. I'm going to show you the answer either way. And I put the answers up here because if I didn't, I wouldn't be able to remember myself. And you'll understand why I'm going to ask you these questions here in just a little bit. I think it's something we all need to think about, and something that we all have in common here tonight. Each and every one of us has this same thing in common that we're going to talk about, and you'll understand here in just a moment. But just a quick pop quiz, just kind of test our knowledge. Not that these things are really that vitally important, but you'll see the point here in a moment. Who's the first president of the United States? All right, that's pretty good. Good job. I don't have any prizes to hand out, but that was right. Okay? What about this one? A little bit harder. Who's the 26th president? It's one of my favorite. He and I shared some of the common hobbies. His name was Teddy Roosevelt. Big hunter, big outdoorsman. I was pretty impressed with some of the things that I've always learned and studied about him. What about the last 10? You could probably get to the last 4 or 5, and then it kind of begins to become a little shady sometimes, doesn't it? That carries you back quite a few years from the one we have now, from Biden all the way back to Nixon. But if you just had to off-the-cuff name 10, and lock them or not, this is not about lockableness. This is about just raw facts. Sometimes those things are hard to recall. Could you have done that? Could you have named the last 10 presidents without any help? Some of us probably could. I know I couldn't, but some of us probably get pretty close. What about this? The Nobel Peace Prize is a pretty prestigious award. Okay? Can you name at least 5, not even the last 5, but just name 5 who have received that over all the time that award has existed? Some presidents have won that, one of which we've already talked about. Other people have won as well and been awarded that. Again, agree with what their principles were or not, they still were influential, whether good influence or not, they still were influential people, or they would not have been awarded that. How many of them can we name? I'm not saying you should be able to, but can you? I'm a big sports fan, as many of you are. Probably know who won the World Series the last year and 2 years ago. Many of you are probably Braves fans, but can you name the last 5, all the way back to the Washington Nationals, who won the World Series? It's a pretty big to-do deal in case you hadn't paid attention. Could you do the same thing with the Super Bowl winners? Probably not. What about the top 3 richest people in the world? Again, you may not like them. They have a big influence. Can you tell me who they are? From the first down to the third? Probably wouldn't guess the first one. It's a French, Bernard Arnault, is a French businessman. And actually that 197 billion has ticked up a couple of billion. I mean, just a couple billion, but kind of come up a little bit since some of those stats came out. What about the second richest person in the world? You ever have those little brown boxes show up on your porch all the time that Donnie and some of his coworkers deliver? Has Amazon stamped on it? Yeah, that guy's behind that. Jeff Bezos is behind that. And then you got Elon Musk, who is behind Tesla and SpaceX, and he bought Twitter, which he changed to basically just X. But regardless, it was Twitter. He's a pretty influential person, very rich. But the point is, regardless if we're talking about money, fame, success, peacemakers or non-peacemakers, whatever you want to call them, they're very influential people. But we struggle naming those names. Why? Well, they're very prominent. They're very prominent people, but here's the thing. When it comes to personal accolades and temporary successes and championships and whatever, position holders, you name it, they come and go. They have since the beginning of time. They were replaced by somebody else. You can get the biggest, nicest, most advanced technological thing that the earth offers, and as soon as you turn it on and make a few swipes, it's outdated. That's the world we live in. Let me tell you what doesn't change and what's not forgotten are these people. Here's another test. You don't have to answer, but think about it. What was your first teacher in school? All the way back to elementary, grade school, kindergarten, whatever you want to call it. What was the name of your first teacher? You probably know, don't you? Pretty easy for me to recall. Addie had the same teacher, which was, I thought, very unique when she started school, but that's easy. Easy to recall. What about your friends and your acquaintances who've helped you through a tough time? If I went around the room tonight, I guarantee you that each and every one of us could give at least 2 or 3 people just right off the cuff who have made a difference in our life. Maybe who picked us up during a tough time. Maybe who helped us when we were really struggling. Maybe gave us words of encouragement that we needed when, we were not getting that in other places. But the point is, those people are easy to recall because they've made a positive difference in your life and you remember them. I have a shoebox at home that I keep locked away and tucked away in places where I keep things that are valuable. And to you, it's just a shoebox. To anybody else, it'd be just a shoebox with a bunch of cards and notes and letters in it. But to me, it's a box that reminds me of why I'm at where I'm at today and why I am who I am. It reminds me of why I didn't quit when I felt like quitting and why I kept pressing on when I really didn't think I could. That box is full of cards that I received from members of the church, from family members, from friends. It's full of letters that even some of the older members, some of the older ladies wrote me when I was growing up at Carragher, and it made all the difference in the world because there was a time where I didn't think I could, nor did I have any business doing it. Sometimes I still feel that way, but they saw different. These names may not resonate with you, but 2 names that always stick in my mind is a man by the name of Ray Miller and another by the name of James Blakely. They were 2 older gentlemen there at Carragher when Julie and I grew up there. And as I look back on that, I've often laughed about it because they used to fake their inability to get up on Wednesday nights and make a talk. Chris probably remembers this. He was there to witness a lot of that. And they had a rotation there on Wednesday night, and those men would get up and do the invitation. And then some of us younger guys come along, and I was too slow to figure out what was going on at the time. But every time their invitation would come up, they would say, man, I just don't feel good today. My back's hurting. And maybe they didn't feel good, but I know they could have got up there looking back on it. But their plan was to get me up there. And I had too much respect for them to tell them no. So I kept doing it. Till finally, I got over the fear. Now, there's still some fear. There's still some measure of nervousness because it's a great responsibility to stand up here and proclaim God's Word. God, I'll tell you that. But they got me over the hump till I could finally start believing that through God's help I could do it. They knew what they were doing. I really didn't have a clue at the time. You can call me a mama's boy all you want to, but my mother's made a huge difference in my life. Mama never had a dishwasher. She still doesn't. So after everybody would go to sleep at night, which everybody would be Daddy and Holly. Usually Holly would be asleep and Daddy would go to work because he worked 3rd shift. But anyway, I'd be up late. If something on my mind, I would sit on the counter, which is not ideal, but I would sit on the counter in the kitchen and my feet would be over in the backside of a chair that was at the table there in the dining area. And whatever's on my mind, she would either fuss at me about or encourage me through it, and that got me through some tough times. Conversations sitting on the counter in the kitchen made all the difference in the world. My grandmother's made a huge difference in my life. My grandmother on the Tucker side used to have lunch once a month on Sunday. Good meals, awesome food, good rolls. I miss them so bad. I miss her dearly. But I knew that when I left that day, before I left, there'd be a stack of papers on her entertainment center. For those of you younger people who don't know what that is, used to there was box TVs, and there was in this big brown case, and she had one for the longest, and those papers would be stacked up on there, and it would be her notes. It would be some sermon topic or some sermon idea, and you wouldn't believe the sermons that I got from her over the years. Same thing from my grandmother on my mother's side. She, because of her health, couldn't go to church a lot from times later on in her life, but she was a devoted studier of God's Word, and she would have books and little inspirational things, and I've got a stack of those at home this tall, and I still get sermons out of them to this day. Made a huge difference in me. Tell you another lady that made a difference in my life. Notice how the women really have a huge difference. There's a lot of men that have influenced me, but sometimes it's the subtle encouragements that are done when nobody else hears it. But Julie's grandmother on the Taylor side, Granny Wanda as we call her, made a huge difference in me. Now, she's going to kill me when I tell you this story, but I'm going to tell you anyway. Because I'm going to brag on her in a minute and embarrass her, so that's okay. Some of you don't know this, but Julie and I, we're on our third stint of being in love. The first 2 times it didn't work out too good. This third time's been a lot better. But we dated a couple times, broke up a couple times, but in between time 2 and time 3, there was a lot of arrogance going on my part. There was a lot of pride going on, and there was a lot of stubbornness on both of our part because neither one of us wanted to admit we were wrong. So we went on like that for a pretty good while. And if you hadn't picked up on it yet, she and I both went to Carriger growing up, so that made it more tough. Had to look at it every time I went to church thinking, what am I doing? But I didn't have enough humility to say, I'm sorry, and let's move on. So we went on like this for quite a while. And finally, I was sitting out there one Sunday morning after church was over. I was leaned up against a vehicle, talking with my buddies, being all cool and whatnot. And I looked across the parking lot, here she comes. And I wish I had a picture of it. She had on this, it was summertime, and she had on this little flowery dress. Oh, she looked so pretty. Here she comes. And I thought, I'm going to be tough. I'm going to be tough, and I'm going to stand firm. So she got over there to me. Of course, I'm leaned up against the vehicle, and I said, can I help you? And I'm thinking, well, that was a dumb. But I'm thinking, can I help you? And she had her Bible in one hand and had her hand like this. And she said, and her grandmother, she cooked lunch every Sunday. Had her hand up there like this. She says, Granny Wanda wants you to come eat lunch today. And I sat there and I thought, well, what am I going to do? I know what that food's going to be like. So I finally said, yeah, I'll come. And she just rolled her eyes and walked off. She didn't want to ask me. She made her come ask me. But over dinner and later on that evening, we finally got over ourselves, and we've been together ever since. Made a difference. Kind of an odd way to do it, but I have always given her the credit for us finally being back together. And I said it the other night when I was talking about Casey, but you have no idea what Julie does for us, for the kids, for me. You don't always see this polished preacher. When I don't know I'm really polished, but I'm not all that put together at home sometimes. I have days like anybody else. I get discouraged. I get frustrated, not necessarily with any of you, just with life and just with me. And she has always been there to whip me back in shape. There's a lot of things that go on behind the scenes that people don't see. Those people are called difference makers. You don't remember the first list that we talked about. People forget them, but you remember the difference makers. Tonight I want to ask you, are you one of them? Are you a difference maker? And will you make a difference in the lives of people that way down the road somebody may talk about you and say, so-and-so made a huge difference in my life way back when, and I stand here today because of it. As God's people, we want to be difference makers. And what I want to do tonight, I want to talk about some in the Bible who have been that, and then ask perhaps an even more important question than what I've asked thus far, and that is, how can we be a difference maker? Let's think about a few. Let's run through. We won't take a lot of time on these, but I do want to run through them. You got to start with Abraham. I mean, he definitely made a difference in so many people in his life. But just one person, for instance, take Lot. He made a huge difference in his life. He didn't have to take him in. He didn't have to take him with him on the road to follow God to the land of Canaan, but he did. And not only did he, but he gave him a choice of where to settle. Abram's the elder there. He really has the choice, but he gives Lot a choice of where he wants to go and where he wants to settle. And then when his choices lead him down a dark path, and when his choices lead him down an avenue that would cause him to be lost in sin and caught away in battle and become a captive, guess who was there to save him? Abraham. Abraham made a difference in a lot of different lives, but if I had to pick one, I would say Lot. Lot would have never been Lot had it not been for Abraham. He still made some bad mistakes, but look how often he was there to encourage him and to help him along the right path. The thing I think about when I think about Abraham and a difference makers are not selfish, and we're going to get to that later on in this lesson, but he let him make a choice. He gave him the best. He gave him the first choice. Does that remind us of ourselves? What about Joseph? We've been talking about Joseph quite a bit in Genesis on our lessons on Sunday morning. Joseph was a difference maker. Not only did he make a difference in the lives of those that he met in his struggles, but he was a difference maker in those who could have cared less about him. He saved Israel. Joseph was the Savior of Israel because he was a difference maker and he cared about people, all people. And because of that, he was allowed to be put into a position where he could save a whole nation of people. That's a difference maker. It's somebody who doesn't necessarily focus on the fact that they're mistreated, but focus on the fact that there is a will that they need to carry out from God, and they focus on that, and from that they become a positive difference maker. What about Moses? There's a lot of things we can say about Moses, but really, and Troy likes to bring our attention to Hebrews 11 a lot, and he's right there in the middle of it. And so such an important passage really describes who he really was. It says, by faith Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to do what? To suffer affliction with God's people than enjoy the passing pleasures of sin. He had a choice. He could have lived out the entirety of his life and not had to worry about anything. But he chose to make a difference in God's people. A lot of times we're pretty hard on Moses because he made excuses, because he hit the rock rather than speaking to the rock and other things. But you got to give it to him. He would have never been in that situation had he not stood up against the Egyptians. Why did he do that? Because he wanted to be a difference maker. He didn't want to sit back and say, well, I'll just let somebody else handle this. Maybe he tried to dodge sometimes, but for the most part, Moses was a difference maker. I'll tell you another difference maker was Joshua and Caleb. When those 12 spies were sent into the land of Canaan, and 10 of them came back, and their knees were knocking together, and their hands were over their eyes, and they were saying, they're like giants in this land, and they're huge, and we're like grasshoppers in their side, and we can't go there. They'll just wipe us out. They'll sweep the floor with us. Joshua and Caleb stood up and said, yeah, we can do it. With God, we can do it, and we can go and take this land. And had it not been for Joshua and Caleb, everybody 20 years and younger would have probably died and been wiped out as well. But they made the difference in their life, didn't they? You've got to mention Queen Esther. We'll go ahead and do her. We'll come back to David. You've got to mention Queen Esther. Probably we could use her and the quote that we have from Mordecai in regards to her and just build the entire lesson off of that. But what did he say to Queen Esther in regards to standing up against evil Haman and standing up to King Ahasuerus and pleading the part of Israel's people or the people of Israel? What did he say? He says, for who knows if you've come to the kingdom for such a time as this. Such a time as this to do what? To make a difference. To make a difference for God's people. What about David? David obviously was a difference maker, a man after God's own heart, but if I had to pick one moment in his life that he really made a difference, it would be that one when he faced Goliath. A lot of times we forget this part of the story. A lot of times we focus on David took a stone, put it in his sling. We know the song, we sing it with the kids, hit him in the forehead, he hits the dust, story over. But what we forget in that story is, as we read the context of the passage there, is that there was a 40-day standoff with Goliath. We forget that. For 40 days straight, they stood out there, and Saul and the other men of Israel would go out to battle, and Goliath would come out there in all of his apparel and all of his battle array, and they would go, and they would run back to the hills. They did that for 40 days because they were cowards. And David comes onto the scene and says, who is this guy running his mouth? I mean, are we just going to stand by and let him run God's people down? Who is this? And he said, I'll go fight him. Being willing to stand up when everybody else runs the other way, that's called a difference maker. Are we that bold? Are we that faithful? Are we that strong in belief that God will fight our battle just like David told Goliath? If we're going to be a difference maker, that's what it's going to take. What about Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah? When a time when God's people were coming back from captivity and they needed all the help in the world to try to get built back up, to read the law, to reestablish the temple, to rebuild the wall. All those things had to be done. Somebody had to do it. Somebody had to lead the fight in doing so. Well, you read of these people here who made a difference. I think about Elijah and how he was so influential in his life, but there was a young guy coming behind him that was full of zeal and full of fervor, and he wanted everything that Elijah had. You know, he could have just kind of kicked him to the side and said, boy, I ain't got time for you. But he didn't. He took time with him. And he built him up and he encouraged him, and he did allow him to have that double portion according to God's will. Think about all the great things that Elisha did. Casey mentioned Simon of Cyrene the other night, talked a lot about him. I won't re-preach that sermon, couldn't do it near as good anyway. But have you ever really just spent a lot of time to think about how important it was that he helped Jesus bear that cross? I think Casey may have just briefly mentioned the other night about how that cross must have been heavy, especially after having been scourged, of which 80% of people didn't survive. But he survived the scourging and then had to carry that cross up the hill to the hill of Calvary, the hill of Golgotha. And those crosses, sometimes the history you read on that's different. Sometimes the Romans forced them to carry the whole cross. A lot of times they were forced just to carry the horizontal beam. But either way, you're talking 200-300 pounds on your back that is already torn to shreds. It was a near impossible task for anyone. And yet Simon of Cyrene was compelled, but still did it. Think of the difference he made. Jesus had to make it to the top of that hill. That cross had to be there for him to be hung on it. And look at the difference he made. Think about Jesus and Barabbas. He mentioned this as well. What about Barabbas? You know, it's interesting. We're not really told if he ever believed on Christ, if he ever became a Christian. We're not told if he straightened his life up, didn't join any more insurrections. We're not told. But of all the people personally that benefited that day, obviously everybody benefited. But just on a monetary term, he benefited more than anybody. I mean, he should have been the one on the cross. But he got released because Christ made a difference in his life. I wonder how that changed his life, if it changed it at all. I have to believe and I have to think in my mind that it made a difference in him for the good. What about Aquila and Priscilla? I said we'd read in Acts chapter 18. Let's look there. Acts chapter 18, verse 24. Love this story about Aquila and Priscilla and how they helped Apollos. Notice what it says here, verse 24. Now a certain Jew named Apollos, born at Alexandria, which would add to the fact that he is very smart, very eloquent, because he had access to quite a bit of knowledge. He was an eloquent man and mighty in the Scriptures, came to Ephesus, and this man had been instructed in the way of the Lord, and being fervent in the Spirit, he spoke and taught accurately the things of the Lord, though he only knew the baptism of John. So this guy's on fire, but his knowledge is limited in regards to the Scripture. He only knew John's baptism. So he began to speak boldly in the synagogue, and when Aquila and Priscilla heard him, they took him aside and explained to him the way of God more accurately. You know, they could have kind of snubbed him and said, this young boy, he's got a lot of zeal, got a lot of fervor, but, you know, he's got some learning to do. He'll get there one day. But they didn't do that, did they? They said, son, let's go over here and talk. They didn't insult him, didn't run him in the ground, didn't make him feel stupid. They got him off to the side, and they explained to him more accurately the way. And I want you to notice the difference in verse 27. And when he desired to cross over to Achaia, the brethren wrote, exhorting the disciples to receive him. And when he arrived, they greatly helped those who had believed through grace, for he vigorously refuted the Jews publicly, which wasn't an easy thing to do, showing from the Scriptures that Jesus is the Christ. Apollos was Apollos because two people pulled him to the side and said, look, son, you need to be a little bit more informed. I have had people do me that way for years. I've been preaching for over 20 years, and I have had people do that the entire time, and I hope they continue. Because I need help. I miss it sometimes. Those people made a difference because they love me enough and love the truth enough to say, look, you may have looked at this wrong. Yeah, I did. So let's correct it together. Do we do that? Are we loving and faithful enough, caring enough to say, hey, maybe we need to correct this and get back on path? I may say something wrong in tonight's sermon. I already said I'm kind of sleepy anyways, losing that hour of sleep. I'm not perfect. No one is. We may miss something along the way. Do we care enough about somebody to make a difference and say, look, we need to look this a little bit closer? Aquila and Priscilla made all the difference in his life. Think about Barnabas. When Paul was not Paul, when he was still Saul of Tarsus, to everybody else, he was still a Christian killer. And Barnabas said, no, I've seen him. He's changed. He's been baptized, and you need to believe him. Had Barnabas not vouched for him, I don't know if the church would have ever accepted him. You ever had somebody stand up for you? You put in for a job before in your life? You ever had to write down a reference? Probably so. Barnabas was the best reference that Paul ever had. And it came at the most vital time in his life. Are we that type of person for those around us? Are we difference makers? To be able to stand up and say, I'll be there to encourage you. Paul, he returned that favor to somebody else. Just take Timothy, for instance. You could talk about Titus. You could talk about John Mark. You could talk about so many others. But Paul took Timothy under his wing, not as his son, but as his spiritual son, and made all the difference in him. We're not told a lot about Timothy's preaching, but I can only imagine how strong he was because he had a man like Paul saying, this is something you need to think about. You need to think about this. You need to be wary of this. And he brought him along the whole time. Difference makers. They make all the difference in the world. Now, we could go on and on and on, but we got to get to a lesson at some point. Right? So the question is, how can I be a difference maker? Turn over to Philippians chapter 2. Philippians chapter 2. We'll try to pick up the pace a little bit and get to the point so we can have a point to work off of, right? Philippians chapter 2, beginning in verse 1. Therefore, if there is any consolation in Christ, if any comfort, any love, any fellowship of the Spirit, if any affection and mercy, fulfill my joy by being like-minded, having the same love, being of one accord and of one mind. And really it gets down to the point in verse 3. Let nothing be done through selfish ambition or conceit, but in lowliness of mind let each esteem others better than himself. Let each of you look out not only for his own interest, but also for the interest of others. And the rest of the verses 5 through 11, talk about how Christ was humbled and yet how he was exalted. So what do we learn from that? Several points. One, if you're going to be a difference maker, you cannot be selfish. We established that from the get-go with Abraham. Had he been selfish, he would have said, Lot, you go over here, but I'm going to take this because it's what I want. No, he didn't do that. He said, you go where you want to. If you're going to be a difference maker, you can't be in a bubble and be self-centered. You got to be thinking about that other person. How many of us are thinking about that other person first? I think we think about the other person, but sometimes it comes after we get everything we want to. When are we thinking about the other person? And when are we thinking about their well-being? You have to esteem others better than yourself. You have to look out for others. And as Christ, you take the form of a bondservant, and a bondservant is a slave. When Jesus, after supper was ended that night, and he girded himself with a towel and began to wash the disciples' feet, you know what he did? He took the form of a bondservant. That's what the servants did. They washed the nasty feet as they came into the house. Jesus did that, and he says, as I have done, so you should also do. And that's what Paul is talking about to the church of Philippi here. Be bondservants. Be humble. It takes a lot of humility to do that. But we have to in order to be obedient to God. How can we be a difference maker? We always have to be thinking of that other person. Here's some very simple verses. We'll just read through them. Romans 14, verse 21. It's good neither to eat meat, nor drink wine, nor do anything by which your brother or can cause your brother to stumble. Do we do that in life? If we're doing something that maybe we're at liberty to do, but it bothers someone else, do we kind of dial that back in respect for them? Or do we say, I don't care about you, it's my life, I'll live it how I want to live it? Is that our attitude? That's the attitude of most today. I don't care. If you're offended, get over it. That's not the way that we should live as God's people, as being difference makers. 1 Corinthians 10, 23 and 24, all things are lawful for me, but not all things are helpful. All things are lawful for me, but not all things edify. Let no one seek his own, but each other's well-being. Is that how we live our lives? Are we self-centered, revolving around self, or are we trying to help other people? 1 Corinthians 10, verse 33, not seeking my own profit. Paul says, I've tried to please all men. Not that it becomes a men pleaser, that he just does whatever in order to get people's vote. No, he does God's will, but he strives to accommodate all people, not seeking his own profit. Why? To make them feel good? To have a buddy? No. To save them. Paul says, I become all things to all men that I might save some. And that's what he meant. Not seeking his own profit, but the profit of many. We could go on and on about that, but here's the thing. We understand the importance of how we should be a difference maker, and we kind of understand the idea of how we do that. You don't be selfish, you're humble, you always think about that other person. Here's another side of that. How urgent are you in doing that? When you read the book of Jude, obviously only one chapter, but when you look at Jude chapter 1, verses 22 and 23, we have a pretty good idea of what this means. On some you have compassion, making a distinction, speaking of those who are struggling, going through difficult times in sin, but others save with fear, pulling them out of the fire, hating even the garment defiled by the flesh. What does that mean? Simply stated, what that means is there are some people that you work with gradually. There are some that you work with as time permits, and there are some that you snatch out quickly as you can because they're literally on fire. And I've always tried to take that not as a literal fire, but as an eternal fire. They are about to burn for eternity if they don't change, and you got to snatch them out of it. Sin has that result. And when we see somebody that is lost in sin and we just walk by and don't say anything, they're literally burning or near to it. And we're not trying to fan the flames at all. We're not trying to extinguish the flames. We're not trying to pull them out of it. We're just standing by. Is there an urgency to save the lost? And do we understand that time is of the essence? You know, we might think one day when I'm better, one day when I get all of my stuff in a row, I'll be a difference maker. But here's the thing, you may not have that time and they may not either. You could be their only line of hope. And as it says in James chapter 5, verses 19 through 20, that he who turns a sinner from the error of his way will save a soul from death and cover a multitude of sins. That's what we want to be. But guess what? The opposite of that is also true. If we do not turn a sinner from the error of his way, we will not save their soul from death, and we will not cover a multitude of sins. Guess what happens? They are lost. Whose fault is it? They have to answer for it. But could you not have made a difference? In our books, and we won't read it all for the sake of time tonight, but I do want to look at just a little bit of it. Number 799. Open your psalm book. Let's look at that just for a moment tonight. We're about done, I promise. But I got to make this point before we bring our thoughts to a close. Number 799, you never mentioned him to me. Notice the first verse. When in the better land before the bar we stand, how deeply grieved our souls will be. If any lost one there should cry in deep despair, you never mentioned him to me. Notice the chorus. You never mentioned him to me. You helped me not the light to see. You met me day by day and knew I was astray. You never mentioned him to me. There are some songs in our songbooks that I love to sing. That ain't one of them. Because that song scares me to death. But we probably need to sing it more. I don't know what's going to happen in the day of judgment in regards to what we will say and what we won't say and what we'll be thinking and what we won't be thinking. Personally, I think we'll probably be so in awe of everything that's going on between the trumpet, between the sound of the archangel, between Christ coming in the clouds, between the heavenly hosts and all the angels coming with him and the dead in Christ rising first and all this going on. I think we'll just kind of be in awe of all that. I don't know if we'll say anything, but maybe we could. Maybe we might. And just what if? What if we're standing there, and I don't know if we'll stand single file, I don't know if we'll be in a big group, I don't know if it'll look like this, I don't know what it'll look like. I don't think our minds can really fully comprehend that. But as we're being judged, what if somebody beside of us says, hey, why didn't you tell me about Jesus? Well, I don't know what I would say. Do you? What would you say? When you walked with them day by day, and you knew they were astray, it would never mention Him to them. I tell you, friends, that scares me to death. I could be lost, but I might cause somebody else to be lost because I kept my mouth shut or because I didn't try to help them. Because I was too busy to be a difference maker. I don't know how true that song is, but I don't want to find out. What about you? I want to be a difference maker. I want to do every good that I can do, as I believe you do. And I want to do every good that I can do while time permits, because life is as a vapor. John 9 and in verse 4 says, I must work the works of Him, Jesus says, who sent me while it is day, while the night is coming when no man can work. Jesus says, I got to get busy because I don't have much time. And guess what? Neither do we. Neither do we. When Jesus talks about that great judgment in Matthew chapter 25, He talks about two different people, two different groups of people. He talks about some sheep and He talks about some goats. Folks, you don't want to be a goat. Because of all the opportunities that the goats had to do good, they didn't do good. But the sheep, on the other hand, they did. And He lists all these things that they did, whether it's go see the sick or go see those in prison or clothe people or feed people or whatever. And they said, wait a minute, when did we do all these things for you? What did Jesus say? He said, inasmuch as you did it to the least of these, my brethren, you did it to me. Those people are difference makers. Those people are sheep. Those people enter God's kingdom. On the other hand, there are some over there that did not do it. And He said in regards to that, inasmuch as you did not do it to the least of these, you didn't serve your Lord. So number one, I ask you, are you serving the Lord? Number two, I ask you, what side of judgment will you be on? Will you be a difference maker? Or will you just ride it out and live for yourself? Jesus taught us to live for that other person. Jesus taught us to be a difference maker. I wouldn't be standing up here tonight if it weren't for difference makers in my life. You probably wouldn't be sitting where you're sitting if it weren't for difference makers in yours. The question is, what are you going to be for that other person? Think about that. I think that's something we all need to think about, and we need to live accordingly. And if we're not, then we need to change accordingly. We need to get ourselves right before it's too late. We need to get that old plank out of our eye, and we need to help anybody that we can with that speck in theirs. Be a difference maker in somebody's life. And when you stand before the bar, the other side of that is they might just be standing beside of you. And they might say, thanks. Now let's go see Jesus face to face. Be great, wouldn't it? What an awesome day that would be. But that starts today. That starts today. If you accept the Lord's invitation, we hope you'll come while we stand, while we sing.